Good afternoon, I'm Andy Zelleke. I'm the co-director of the Center for Public Leadership, and on behalf of the school and center, Dean Elwood and Dean Gergen, the director of the center, I want to welcome all of you to this special event and extend on David's behalf their warm greetings to everybody and their sincere regrets at not having been able to attend today. I also want to obviously very warmly welcome Secretary Chertoff. It's a great privilege to have you with us at the Kennedy School. I want to be brief here, but I do want to acknowledge a couple of other important people, most notably Kathy and Wayne Reynolds, for all that they have done, and also their daughter Megan, who's with them today. As the many Reynolds Fellows in the room can attest, what Kathy and Wayne have done is really a great service to these young change agents, as well as to the school and to the university. And it's in so many different ways. Let me just give you one that might not be known to everybody. There is an undergraduate course on social entrepreneurship for the first time ever at Harvard College in 350, 60 years, whatever it is. We now have a course on social entrepreneurship at Harvard College, and I can say, having had something to do with the institution of that course, it would not have happened but for the initiative taken by the Reynolds. So thank you so much, Kathy and Wayne Reynolds, for all you've done. I also want to say that the fourth cohort of the Reynolds Fellows who are in the room now, I think reflect very well on the program, which just gets stronger and stronger every year. And that's, again, a testament to the Reynolds. So Kathy and Wayne, thank you so much for everything. And I know your time today is limited, but we look forward on your next visit to having the fellows have a chance to spend a little more time with you. Let me also acknowledge two more people. John Haig, the executive dean of the school, thank you for being with us. And Billy Shore, who was a very special person in the Reynolds program. As you all know, he is the faculty advisor for the Reynolds program and the inspiration for so many of the fellows, and a true giant in the field of social entrepreneurship for all he's done in combating hunger. Finally, we're very fortunate to have with us Professor John White of the Kennedy School faculty, and John exemplifies public service at very high levels in a variety of roles. He's been the Deputy Secretary of Defense, he's been the Deputy Head of the Office of Management and Budget, and before that, Officer of the Marine Corps. And at the Kennedy School, he is the Belfer Lecturer and heads up the program on the Middle East Initiative. Please welcome Professor White. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy, and good afternoon. It's my honor to introduce our guest for today, Secretary Chertoff. Secretary Chertoff was sworn in February of 2005 to his current position and unanimously voted in by the U.S. Senate. He also served earlier as in the U.S. Circuit as a U.S. Circuit Court judge with the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, and was confirmed by the Senate for that high position as well. He's previously been confirmed also in 2001 to serve as an Assistant Attorney General of the Criminal Division in the Justice Department. And prior to that, he was in private practice at Latham & Watkins. But most importantly, of course, the Secretary, to whom we owe a great deal of gratitude, has taken on one of the toughest jobs that you can in Washington. He holds one of the most important and challenging national security jobs that we have in the country today. He has a broad portfolio ranging from counterterrorism to relief from natural resources to disasters. Perhaps most challenging from a management point of view, he is responsible for shaping the myriad capabilities of some 22 agencies into an effective, coherent cabinet-level department. And we are all better because of his remarkable leadership. So thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Well, thank you very much for the very kind introduction. Those of you who've been in Washington know that in our cabinet department, it's always the deputies who actually run things. The cabinet secretary is just the window dressing, so it's a very high praise indeed. I also want to thank the Reynoldses for extending me the invitation, and also for their really outstanding contribution through this program, which I think is a great example of taking the 21st century approach to dealing with social problems. It's a marriage of free market incentives with social benefit, and I think it's one of the exciting things as we go into a new century, when we try to organize ourselves a little bit differently to deal with some of the most pressing challenges that we face. I was here back in February, and I talked about why Washington doesn't work, and I'm going to try to pick another somewhat related and topical issue, which again is a reflection of my having spent almost 4 years in my current job, and then 2 years back earlier in the administration as head of the criminal division, where, among other things, I had to deal with the 9/11 attacks and also the big Enron meltdown and all the associated corporate fraud issues that arose. And the topic I've chosen to focus on is risk management, and when it is that our risk management has failed us. And I speak from the vantage point of having lived through, I think, 3 of the greatest catastrophic meltdowns of risk that have occurred in my lifetime. One was 9/11 and everything that ensued in terms of terrorism. One was Katrina and all of the incredible natural disasters we've had in the last 4 years. And the third is the meltdown in the financial community that we're currently experiencing. I haven't personally been a part of that as a government official, although Lord knows as a person who has investments, I've suffered with everybody else. But I was part of the response to Enron. And some of the issues that were presented in the corporate accounting crisis in 2001 and 2002 are presented again here. So I think I've had a pretty good front row seat to what do you do when our risk management doesn't work, how do you deal with the outcome, and most important perhaps, how do we avoid having this problem in the future? Because I have to tell you, I think the area in which government has failed the most, and this is not a single administration, this is government going back as far as I've lived and as far as I've read, is in assessing risk, managing risk, and dealing with the fact that managing risk does not mean guaranteeing against risk. We tend to live in a social environment, and certainly been this way in the last 2 or 3 decades, where public discourse prefers not to focus on risk that is in the future. It prefers to focus on risks that have just come about or just yielded some catastrophe. We're very much backward looking. We're very much focused on the last thing that happened and how do we repair it. After 9/11, quite rightly, we got focused on the issue of terrorism and counterterrorism. But much of the focus was literally exclusively on the repetition of the exact threat that had been carried out on September 11th. There was considerably less enthusiasm looking at other threats that might not have come to pass, but might come to pass in the future. In the run-up to Katrina, for years people were predicting problems with the levee system in New Orleans, as well as the levee system in other parts of the country. And time and again, when the occasion arose to invest money in a disciplined way over a period of time in strengthening the levees, repairing them, maintaining them, there was always some better use for the money. Something with a more immediate return on investment, more immediate gratification. Some might describe it as pork. And this always wound up sucking up money that otherwise could have been used on these investments. Of course, once the catastrophe occurred and the levee failed, there was a tendency then to look backwards and see who we can blame. And then to spend probably 3 or 4 times as much money in repairing the damage and the consequences than it would have cost to prevent it. And of course, without getting into the financial crisis, which is still unfolding, you can see again, if you read in the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years, there's been a lot of warning about the need not to over-leverage ourselves, not to take on too much debt, not to put too much faith in the rising value of housing. And not that much has been done about it over the last 10, 20 years as this has slowly developed. Now, of course, there'll be a lot of backward-looking reaction and perhaps a little overreaction. So, looking at all of these experiences, I've tried to step back and see, are there some general lessons learned about risk management? Because I think what we've seen in the last 20, 30 years is the consequences of a risk failure have become much greater. Globalization, interdependence, the fact that technology has now given much greater leverage to terrorists than was the case 50 years ago. All of these things mean that the consequence of a failure is very much more profound than was the case a century ago or 2 centuries ago. And that's only going to accelerate as we get more interdependent, more technologically sophisticated, as the events move more rapidly and communications become more seamless. The consequences of a failure will be, and the ripple effect of a failure will become much more dire. That's not a suggestion that we ought to retreat from the 21st century or that we ought to get into a clench where we avoid all risk, because that would be a recipe for no growth and no progress. It is a suggestion that we need to start managing risk in a forward-looking way. And that means recognizing we will not eliminate risk. We have to understand what the greatest risks are. We've got to draw those down to the point at which it no longer becomes cost-effective to do so. And then once we've agreed upon what that right balance is, we should accept the consequences that occur when a risk that you've taken reasonable steps to prevent nevertheless comes to pass. Because part of managing risk in a cost-effective way is accepting that sometimes the risk will nevertheless come to pass, because we're not guaranteed against it. And that means we have to be mature in how we respond to it. If people in government are told the following thing: there is zero tolerance for failure, and you will be personally harmed and destroyed if there's failure, then we will move to a very risk-averse culture. And that will cause certain downside consequences. You get complaining about this now, by the way, when it comes to what we do in security at the border with visas and things of that sort. And if any of you want to raise it, the specific issue would be questions, I'm happy to address it. I think we are right in how we strike the balance. But for example, when we had the Dubai ports experience, where the administration thought there was no problem with letting Dubai take ownership of the cranes that operated our various seaports, some people began to say, well, you can't do that because if somehow something bad happens, then you'll be held responsible. So obviously zero tolerance for failure approach leads to not having that investment. A zero tolerance for failure approach would lead to our strip searching everybody who gets on the airplane. It would lead to our banning all hand luggage on the airplane, not just liquids over a certain size or certain articles, but everything. But the consequence of that would be many fewer people would want to fly. So that's, to me, the challenge that we face. So how do I see striking the balance? Well, I begin by saying that my general presumption is most people and most institutions are best situated to evaluate their own risk and to decide what is a cost-benefit way to deal with that risk. That's the presumption. That's the theory behind the free market, that people know their own business best, that they have the best incentive to strike the right cost-benefit, and that therefore we ought to default to allow them to be the risk managers. But that hasn't always proved to be a successful solution in every case. And so what I'm going to outline today is my theory of 3 cases where the government has to get somewhat involved in helping the free market with risk management by setting up rules or boundaries that will help guide decisions in a way that make sure people properly internalize their own risks. Now, I'm beginning with the premise that the free market and personal responsibility is the general right way to measure these things. But even the most passionate advocate for the free market understands that the free market has to have some rules. For example, if you didn't have the rule that contracts are enforced, you couldn't have any trade or transactions, you couldn't have the free market. So there's a government regulation or a rule that sets certain boundaries or limits. Likewise, if you didn't have some testing with respect to the quality and purity of food that you buy, you couldn't go to the grocery store. You couldn't transact business in the free market because you have the transaction costs of checking the quality of what you buy would be so high that would prevent the market from operating. So I think we all have to acknowledge, no matter how passionate we are about the free market liberty, that the market does have to have some rules. Rules against taking things by force and violence, violating your promises, or deceiving people about the quality and the nature of the goods and services you're providing. So the question then becomes, are there some rules we need to put into effect to make sure we properly manage risk? Or to be more precise, to make sure that individual people and individual institutions properly internalize the costs and benefits of their own risks. Because it's my thesis that the failure of the market occurs when people don't properly internalize the costs of failure, so that when they do their cost-benefit analysis on risk management, they're looking at their benefits, they're looking at the costs that they feel or would feel if there was a failure, but they're not really looking at the costs that are externalized to others. And that's where I think we wind up finding ourselves sometimes dealing with cascading failures and then needing to dig ourselves out of a big hole. So what's the first element? Because I'm going to say there are three failures in internalizing risk that we ought to take a look at. One is when we don't properly measure long-term costs with respect to short-term benefits. And that typically occurs either because the manager or the decision maker is not going to be around to experience the cost of a failure. And therefore, from his or her narrow standpoint, it's only the benefit that counts. The cost isn't going to count. We see that in the way some corporations manage their accounting activities. We saw that in the Enron case, where you're busy trying to lift your immediate earnings, and it's kind of like a Ponzi scheme. It may crash someday, but hopefully you'll have cashed out by that time. We also see it when we build dangerously insecure buildings in floodplains or in coastal areas. We don't take out adequate insurance. We don't elevate the way we should to protect ourselves. And we either figure we'll have sold the house by the time the hurricane comes or the flood comes, or worse yet, we believe that once the hurricane comes and the flood comes, even though we haven't had insurance, our government officials will knuckle under to the political pressure to immediately rescue and alleviate the suffering, and will therefore wind up giving people money to rebuild their houses, even though they didn't take out insurance and they shouldn't have built there in the first place. These are all cases in my mind where someone has not properly evaluated the risk to themselves, either because the time horizon isn't right or because what they're figuring is they're going to get rescued anyway. And that's where we've had a failure of will. To come to the example, for example, of building in floodplains. After Katrina, there was an immediate push on the part of some of the communities affected against our insistence that in order to get hazard mitigation flood insurance in the future, you would have to elevate to a level above sea level that would essentially protect you against a 100-year flood or a 100-year storm surge. The answer was, well, it's bad for development, people want to get back in their houses, it's going to slow up the rebuilding. There was every kind of argument made, and many of them have a powerful emotional appeal to force us to basically say, you know what, we won't require you to rebuild above a certain level. We won't require you to move to a higher plane. The difficulty with that is it simply invites us to make the same misallocation and misjudgment about cost and benefit and risk that we made in the first place. I had a dramatic illustration of this in two respects. When I went down to the Gulf this year in anticipation of Hurricanes Gustav and Ike, and then after they hit. The first example is I went to East Texas and I saw a town called Port Arthur, which had been badly flooded by the hurricane. Most of the houses were reduced to complete rubble, but there were about a dozen or so houses that I saw that were pristine. They were virtually untouched, and other than getting the power back up, you could move back into them almost immediately. The difference is those houses, many of which had actually been built by Habitat for Humanity, were all elevated 14 feet above sea level. So when the surge came in at 10, 11 feet, they were left utterly unharmed. And that to me was a crystal clear example of how forcing people to internalize the cost meant that they were going to spend a little extra money to build high, but in the long run, we were all going to be saved the consequence of paying to rebuild from scratch. And that strikes me as a kind of rule and regulation in building that we have to start insisting upon. The second example will take me to my second imperfection, which is the failure that we sometimes have to internalize costs that we throw out to other people. Apart from the time horizon issue, we all know that sometimes the costs of our failure are never going to be felt by us. They're going to be felt by others. The classic example comes from the law of nuisance, going back 100 years, where if I have a piece of property upstream and I take my waste and walk over to the stream every day and I dump it in the stream, I'm not going to feel any of those costs. It's all going to go downriver. It's going to pollute the property of the downstream landowners, but as I weigh my own benefit and cost, I'm getting the benefit of easy waste disposal, and I'm not getting any of the cost of the pollution. That's why the law of nuisance 100 years ago allowed the downstream owners to sue in court to get a court order to prevent people from dumping in the river. Because essentially what the courts were doing is they were forcing people to internalize the cost of the dumping, even though the cost might be felt downstream. This is, again, a common problem that we have in the way we deal with our planning and our free market activity in cases where there are many costs to be externalized that aren't really felt by the person who's making the decision. So I'll come back to the hurricanes. There were two dramatic lessons. One was when the power went down, everybody suffered. And most particularly, if gasoline stations had plenty of fuel but had not bothered to obtain generators, they couldn't pump the fuel. If they couldn't pump the fuel, then people who needed to get gas for their cars so they could drive to the power plant to start the power plant working again, so the power could go to the gas station, couldn't get that fuel. So you see yourself stuck. The gas station can't pump the gas. The people who need the gas to get to the utility can't get to the utility. The utility can't get up and running now, and therefore you can't pump the gas. This is interdependence. This is a world in which all of us depend upon others in order to do our jobs. And for the cost of a generator, you can avoid this entire problem. Now, the good news is it was a little better in these hurricanes than it was back in Katrina and Rita, because we did work hard to beat the bully pulpit with the oil companies over the last few years to get them to get some generators in place. And also we in the states involved bought some generators. But it still comes down to this basic principle. Is it intelligent to do what the state of Florida did, which is mandate for everybody who is going to be licensed to get a gasoline station that they have to have a generator? Because the externality, the cost of their failure to do that, is much more than the lost revenue they themselves will feel when the power goes out. It's a cost that's going to be felt in general. That's another example of a rule that it seems to me ought to go into place in order to, I think, enhance the way we manage risk in the free market. One more example about this is the canal on 17th Street in New Orleans. If you go down there, now as I did a couple days before Hurricane Gustav, you'll see a rather ugly, large structure at the mouth of the canal as it leads into the lake. Of course, those of you who followed Katrina will realize that the major failure of Katrina, the major flooding occurred because the wall along the canal collapsed and the water then flooded most of New Orleans as a whole. What you may not know is this. It flooded because of the surge from Lake Pontchartrain. The water was pushed first up to the northern shore, and then as it receded back, it funneled into that canal, and that pressure caused one of the levees to collapse. We can talk about whether the levees were well designed or not, or could have been reinforced. But there was actually a very easy fix, which we saw used in Gustav, which was to build a wall in place at the mouth of the canal that could be lowered when the storm surge exceeds a certain elevation. It actually was deployed in Gustav and Ike. It worked perfectly. Had it been deployed in 2005, there never would have been a surge into the canal. The canal never would have collapsed. And most of New Orleans, not all of it, but most of it would not have been flooded. So you go, wow, that's an easy answer. How come no one thought about it? Well, it was thought about. People argued years ago we ought to put just such a device and structure at the mouth of the canal. But the people who lived in the neighboring areas didn't like it from an aesthetic standpoint, because it is rather ugly and it does kind of impair your view of the beautiful lakefront. So between their complaints and the complaints of environmentalists and a whole host of not in my backyard critics, it never got built. The sad irony, of course, is that many of the people who protested lost their own homes because they got flooded. Again, a failure to internalize the cost to everybody else because of the people who had the ability to stop it weren't thinking about costs that were either long-term or externalized. The last element of what I think is important in terms of how we make sure we can risk manage in the free market is in my mind, maybe the single most important, and that is the issue of transparency. The one great foundation of free market, in my mind, is the ability to be completely clear about the quality and the nature of what you are transacting your business in. If I go back to Enron, the failure of all those corporations had to do with accounting standards that were not transparent. And I think many would argue the crisis of confidence in financial markets comes from a lack of transparency. On a more prosaic level, I think the Chinese are now feeling, and I think will probably in the near run feel more keenly, the failure that they have to validate and be transparent about the nature and quality of the products they put into the marketplace. Once you lose that transparency, you lose the foundation of any kind of free market activity. So, in short, I guess my plea is someone who has, in one way or another, touched a whole host of crises involving risks that came to pass is not to say the government should now move to a guarantee against risk, which in my mind would stifle the market. It's not to say the market doesn't work. It's simply to say the market can be made to work better. And in much the same way as we accept laws against breach of contract or taking things by force or deception as important enablers for the free market, so too we should accept that rules that force us to internalize our own costs, to internalize the costs that are externalized to others, and to be transparent and clear will ultimately strengthen the marketplace to the benefit of everybody.
Well, thank you so much, and we will take some questions. We've got some microphones that are being passed around, so please have at it.
Please be sure to say who you are and what your affiliation is before you speak.
Hi, Dr. Chertoff. My name is David Lubell. I'm a Reynolds Social Entrepreneurship Fellow here, and I was formerly the director of an organization called the Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition in Tennessee. So we're very interested in the work that your Immigration and Customs Enforcement and also USCIS, United States Immigrations and
Citizenship and Immigration
Services. There's a lot of acronyms. Interested in all of the work that they were doing. My question is not regarding the risk issue, but regarding more of an immigration question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
The project that I'm working on here during my year at the Kennedy School and following this year is trying to bring together immigrants and native-born Americans around talking about immigration, building bridges in communities, and strengthening communities through that work. I saw a lot in Tennessee of the backlash that was happening around immigrants, and a lot of that was a lack of communication. My question is around interior enforcement. I've seen the human costs very closely of raids that have taken place, ICE raids that have taken place across Tennessee, workplace raids, and also the 287G program. 287G is a program in which local law enforcement, you could explain this better than I can probably, but where local law enforcement has an agreement with the Department of Homeland Security to enforce local immigration. And so the human costs have been very dear the raids we've watched as families are separated when people are deported or in prison for a long time. The 287G program, over 5,000 people have been deported in the first year, most of them for driving without a license and being pulled over for that offense. And so my question to you is, given some of the unintended consequences of 287G and some of the unintended consequences of the raids, I know that you are supportive of comprehensive immigration reform, which we both agree is the real solution to this issue, but given the fact that that's not politically right around the corner, what would you recommend to the next secretary as far as dealing with ICE raids, dealing with 287G, and if there are any alternatives to those programs to deal with what we're trying to deal with?
Well, just put it in perspective for those not immersed in this. Last year, the President asked the Secretary of Commerce and me to go and be the point in negotiating with Congress over comprehensive immigration reform, which would have combined tougher enforcement against illegal immigration with a temporary worker program that would bring workers in to satisfy economic needs. It would also come up with a way to resolve the dilemma of people who are here illegally, who are working, who have not otherwise violated the law, to see if there's some way to regularize them and legalize their status, maybe with a fine, which would, of course, have eliminated this issue. I will tell you that in many parts of the country, and it's not a partisan issue, there is a very strong negative reaction against illegal immigration. Probably some of that is driven by feelings that are not particularly charitable. But I will tell you that I've spoken to a lot of people who are offended by illegal immigration. Much of it is driven by the belief that when people violate the law, they should not be rewarded. And there was, after the 1986 amnesty, which was passed with the idea that there would be an amnesty for all illegals in the country, but then tough enforcement. Many people said, well, you had the amnesty, but you never did the enforcement. And therefore, it was like you emptied all the people who were illegal, put them into legal status, and then 12 more million illegals came in. Because they were thinking to themselves, well, this is great, I'll come in illegally, we'll ultimately have more and more illegals, and the government will give us another amnesty. What a great way to become a U.S. citizen or a U.S. resident without having to wait in line like all those people who are actually trying to follow the rules. This really offended me. And I've had the pleasure, and sometimes taking the brickbats of having talked to people all over the country. And you'd be surprised at the passion that people feel about this. So our pitch in immigration reform was we'll do both. We will live up to our promise to enforce, but we do need to find a way to deal with these 12 million. And frankly, we didn't persuade the American public, or enough of the American public, that we would live up to the first part of this. So it seemed to me to become very important to do two things. One, to follow the law as it is currently in force, because that is what we are supposed to do, so we take an oath to do. And second, convince the American people that when the government says it's going to do something, the government will live up to its obligation. Because I thought only if we instilled confidence in the public, the government would live up to the tough part, would the public be willing to come back at some point and say, you know what, now we're willing to look at the other part of this. So what do? We do all kinds of things. We toughen up at the border, we make it harder to get through, and we do enforce the rules against illegal aliens working in this country. If they're caught, for example, committing criminal activity, we deport them. If we find that there are businesses that are largely built on illegal workers, we will in fact arrest the illegal workers. We will make cases against the employers if we have the evidence that allows us to do it. And to give you an idea of what happens, we're talking about businesses not where there's like 10% illegal workers. We're talking 80 to 90% illegal workers, using, in many cases, stealing the identities of legitimate American citizens who pay the price with impaired credit or inability to get loans because they find that their name and their social security number has been trashed. Or they wake up and they're getting dunning letters from IRS about why they haven't paid tax on income they never earned because someone filed a phony, there's phony earnings reported on a phony social security number that was stolen from them. So we do arrest people. Does it cause hardship? Absolutely it does. Anytime parents do something wrong and they go to jail or they get deported, their children suffer. And when I was a prosecutor, I remember standing in courtrooms when we were putting dope dealers in jail, and they were getting 10, 20-year sentences, and the children were there crying, and the judge was saying, well, you should have thought about that before you violated the law. Now, some people believe, yeah, but the problem is immigration is not that serious a law if you violate the law. But here's our problem. If we find someone who's in the country illegally and we release them in the country, we've given them an amnesty. We've basically said to them, yeah, we caught you, we know you're in violation of the law, maybe you've stolen someone's identity, but we're not going to take it seriously, so go forth and go do it again. It strikes me that that would be the best way to be sure we'll never have comprehensive immigration reform. What it will lead to is what we've had over the last 20 years, and what the public perceives with some justification, an unholy alliance between different interest groups, some of whom just want to make sure that their constituents can stay in the country without being deported. Businesses that love it, because these people can be easily victimized, they can be paid very little, they have no place to go. Businesses get all the workers that they need. They don't have the hassle of paperwork, like making sure people get visas and things of that sort. So I think my short answer is this. We found ourselves in we inherited 30 years of what I would consider to be less than candor with the American people on the problem of immigration. I believe the right answer does involve regularizing the status of illegals in the country, having temporary workers come in, giving everybody real identification, and getting the economic value in a way that doesn't exploit them. But I also believe if we do not enforce the law the way it is now, if we unilaterally declare an amnesty, that never in the future will the American public believe that we will do what we said. And I'll give you one last example of, this is, I guess, in the category of tough love, but how I saw this work when I worked for Rudolph Giuliani. There was a big drug problem in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and I was a baby prosecutor. And so what Giuliani said was, we're going to take 1 day a week or 1 day every 2 weeks, and we're going to take all the little drug cases that have never been prosecuted in federal court, that used to be brought into state court and dismissed with basically a ticket. We're going to bring them into the federal system, and we're really going to get jail time. And the judges were horrified because they didn't, you don't become a federal judge to deal with these rinky-dink cases. You want to deal with big cases. The defense lawyers were angry because they were used to bringing the client in and having the client released the same day. But you know something? It worked. Within a matter of a month or two, when we were bringing people in, they would go, damn it, if I'd only known today was going to be federal day, I wouldn't have been selling drugs on the Lower East Side. And it actually changed it. It actually drove many of the drug dealers out of the Lower East Side. It didn't eliminate the problem, but it forced it indoors and it forced it to be less of a public nuisance. That's, I think, my takeaway, which is sometimes, we try to be as humane as we can, make sure that no kids are left unattended. But the reality is law enforcement is by definition tough. But to be credible, you've got to be consistent about it. So I'd be the first person to get back to try to pick up the banner to get a comprehensive solution to this. But it's my message to my successor will be this. If you signal to the country we're creating an amnesty, de facto amnesty, I guarantee you will never get the reform you want.
David, how about a brief question?
I don't mean to filibuster, so if you guys want to go a little further.
Good afternoon, Mr. Secretary. Thank you very much for your time. My name is David Calloway. I'm a Dr. Fellow at Andy School. I'm the Medical Director for Emergency Management at Beth Israel Deaconess. I take the opportunity to thank the Reynolds for opening it up to the Zuckermans also. And thank you for your time today and for managing what is probably one of the most complex bureaucracies our country's ever seen. The question I have has to do with the structure of the DHS and how you plan or you would recommend engaging communities to get involved. It seems like you're emphasizing more of a role in mitigation of risk, which I agree with. And this is sort of a Reynolds question. As the DHS moves towards mitigation, what do you recommend as far as a structure, whether you're moving towards some recommendations towards a Federal Reserve type structure, and how do you engage the public-private partnership with academic institutions, nonprofits, non-government organizations who are entrepreneurs in order to build capacity to respond to risk.
When you say federal reserve, you mean having more regional?
Regional.
More regional offices?
Yes.
Stuff? Well, we have moved a lot to more regional stuff in the last year or two, and I think there's value in doing that. But I'm struck by the just enormously complicated intergovernmental structures we have in this country. We normally begin by dealing with the states, and so we have regions involving a number of states. We deal with the governors. But what you rapidly learn is that some of the governors really don't have very much power. It's really down at the county level or the local level. There are all kinds of interest groups within the states that quarrel with one another. Part of the problem is we have difficulty figuring out how to engage with what level of government to engage with. So I've come to the conclusion, actually, that we ought to take what I call a messy, practical approach to this, which is engaging at as many different levels as we can. And then when we find people who are competent and committed, work with them. And that's going to irritate sometimes people who are higher up in the chain, but it I think is the best way to get things done. So I think we should continue to have regional outposts, but recognizing that we can't get people in every town and city. My idea is that we just send people out into the field as much as possible. Get out there, deal with people at all levels, deal with stakeholder groups, and try to absorb as much as you can about what people are looking to do, and then try to build incentives through public-private partnerships using some of the tools that we have, grant tools, liability protection. We're trying to do this a lot with our cyber project in the private sector. We're saying to the private sector, we want to help you protect your cyber assets. And we can do that because working with the other agencies of the government, we may be able to provide you with certain kinds of tools or information. But we don't want to make you do it because we don't want to have the federal government in the position of looking to come in and kind of stand astride the internet. So here's what we'll do. Well, we have these 18 economic sector groups we've had up for several years now doing infrastructure protection. Working with those groups and with a kind of cross-cutting committee involving some government people and some private people, we want you to examine what are your vulnerabilities. And then we want to work with you to see what is the right way we can enable you to reduce those vulnerabilities. Sometimes it'll be by providing with information and actual capabilities. Sometimes it may be providing with liability protection. Sometimes it may simply be giving you information and allowing you a place to exchange information. And I think my takeaway from this is I would not yet reorganize the department again. I think each reorganization freezes it, creates an upheaval of morale. What I would do is I would incrementally work with all of the existing structures, which I think now have achieved a good deal of penetration into a lot of the different elements of government, and try to use that as a way of really treating each community almost as a separate issue, because each has a separate set of concerns. Meanwhile, at the federal level, we can drive overall federal policy. We can deal with creating a federal plan, which you need to have so that the states and localities can have something they can work with as they set their own plans. Here's the hardest challenge I have, though. In many, and it's particularly acute in public health, in many communities where money is short, let's face it, in many cases it always comes down to money. Public health officials say, this is great, let's pandemic flu and all that, we should plan for it. But right now I've got a crisis in my emergency room. I need the money to deal with this month's problems. I don't want to spend the time and the effort and the money to deal with something that might not happen yet. And that is, in my mind, that original failure to externalize the costs. What these emergency managers are hoping is that the risk of pandemic flu or anthrax attack doesn't happen, or, to be a little maybe cynical, it doesn't happen while they're there. So they can take care of their problem, and then it'll be the next guy's problem. If we learn anything from 9/11, Katrina, and what we're seeing in the financial community now is we can't live that way anymore. We've got to start living as if we will absorb the full costs of our problems. Otherwise, we will be leaving our successes and our children mounting problems and no time to correct.
Hi, Secretary Chertoff. Thanks for being here. My name is Max Anderson. I'm a Reynolds Fellow and a Joint Degree student at the Kennedy School of Business School. And I have a question about your career in leadership. Two parts, actually. One is, what's your next step after you step down as Secretary? What does one do after being Secretary of Homeland Security? And this other question is, as when you were our age, when you were coming out of graduate school, your job title didn't exist. And so as we talk about what do we plan to do, what are our hopes for the future, many of us may be working in roles that don't exist right now. What are the best ways, the advice you give us to prepare ourselves?
Let me deal with the second
I know
question
you
first. It's true. When I came out of school, I went to law school, so I decided to be a lawyer. And at that point, I was interested in public service, and I thought it would be a wonderful way to do that was to be a prosecutor, because I got interested in trying cases and thought that it would be a great opportunity to do that and also serve the public. And it was a terrific opportunity, and I would say that my career progressed pretty much in a linear fashion up until 2005. I became an assistant U.S. attorney, eventually President Bush 41 appointed me U.S. attorney. I did my stint in private practice. I represented people who actually did a lot of white-collar criminal work, and a pretty typical thing. When this president came to office, I became head of the criminal division. But there, the unexpected happened. What I thought I would face, which was the stuff I'd done all my life, which was corrupt politicians, corporate fraud. I mean, that was all there, but we had 9/11. We had terrorism, which I had dealt with somewhat, because I was involved in the first World Trade Center investigation. But certainly that became an overwhelming game changer in terms of the role of the government of law. And so that's an example of an unintended event. And a couple years later, the president appointed me to the Court of Appeals, and in a normal course, that I would have figured that was it. The lesson I bring to you is in 2005, I was asked would I be interested in being considered for this job. And I guess I could have taken I've had a game plan my whole life. I've been lucky enough to have it play out pretty much better than I could have hoped. Why disturb a good thing? I know what I'm doing. I know how to be a judge. It's a nice life, and it's in my comfort zone. It's something I've worked with all my life. On the other hand, I believed passionately that we were facing really the challenge of my generation, and I was also willing to get out of my comfort zone to try to do something that was different if I felt I could make a contribution. So that's my message. There's no way to plan for what life throws your way. The test will come when someone says to you, here's a deviation from your game plan. And you have to ask yourself the question, do I want to stick to my game plan, or do I want to take a chance on doing something that if I don't do, I may never have the opportunity again? And I'm not sure there's a right answer to that. But I would say that's, to me, kind of the pivot, the inflection point on my career. In terms of what I do afterwards, I have really no idea. But I will say that I do still care deeply about the issues I've talked about. And I think I've had the benefit of having been in the middle of some of the most challenging events of my lifetime. So you kind of get in a kind of reminiscent type of mood, and you kind of want to convey that a little bit. So I hope what I will do is I'll do some speaking and some writing and stay involved in these issues, because I've had a lot of painful lessons over the 4 years, but they're very valuable lessons. And I'd like to be able to continue to impart them.
Laura.
Oh. Hi, thank you very much. My name is Laura Bacon. I'm a Reynolds Fellow, and I'm at the Kennedy School here. And I really appreciated your discussion of risk, and I think especially of economic risk, social risk, political risk. And what I'd like to hear more about is environmental risk, not so much just short-term, but long-term environmental risk, because I think climate change is really implicated in Homeland Security. And because of the Reynolds last year, we got to go to New Orleans and to see the devastation of Katrina, and it's clear that the devastation of the bayous and the destruction of the wetlands and the depletion of sediment and the river delta are making the consequences much worse. And we know that storms are going to become more frequent and more severe. So how is your department looking at sort of much longer term environmental risk?
That's a great question. I can't tell you what the climate change could cause. That's not my area. But you're right that over a period of time, the wetlands have degraded. This is a great example of unintended consequences. I'm told by the people down there that over a period of decades, as we dredged the Mississippi River to make it easier for commerce, that has had a negative impact on the wetlands. And so that has led to the consequence of not being able to blunt the storms. One answer would be to spend an enormous amount of money rebuilding the wetlands. Here's where there's going to have to be some risk management. You're going to have to ask yourselves these questions, because everything's a trade-off. Begin with this proposition. There's a limit to the amount you can spend. So if you've got $50 billion, what are you going to spend it on? You could spend the $50 billion, I'm just making the numbers up to make a point. You could spend the $50 billion to rebuild the wetlands. But then you're not going to have the money for a financial crisis, or you're not going to have the money to shore up dams that are crumbling, or you're not going to have the money to do something else. You might look at New Orleans and say, you know, maybe we ought to move the people out of the really low-lying areas and get them up to higher areas. Or maybe we ought to force them to build on an elevated level in order to do that. Maybe, as is the case in certain parts of Plaquemines Parish, the number of people living there is so small that to put into effect what you'd have to do to protect them, you'd have to spend literally $2 or $3 million per person. You might be better off saying to each person, here's $500,000, go move someplace else. Now, I know that sounds harsh, but here's the problem. We live in a world of math. If all you have is $50 billion, is that where you're going to put it? Are you going to not spend it on pandemic vaccines? Or you're not going to spend it on something else? Because this is the really hard part about government. This is what I would suggest to you when you make the decision to get into government. You ought to think about it very carefully. And it's something that I've had the particular opportunity to do because I have a broad department, so I really do make a lot of trade-offs. You can't give everybody what they want or what they deserve, because there isn't enough money to do that. So you're going to have to say at some point, who's going to give up something so that somebody else can get something? Would I rather spend the $50 billion to prevent a certain number of deaths from illness and force the people, or tell the people who are living in a flood zone you're going to have to move, we're not going to spend that $50 billion protecting them? You know, people in Sacramento built right up to the levee, the river levees that were the old agricultural levees built 100 years ago. I can tell you that just from looking at the landscape, because I've been out there, that's a flood waiting to happen. Because you can see with your own eyes, you can see the water percolating up through the ground. What do we tell those people? Do we tell them we're going to spend $50 billion to shore up their levees? Or do we say, hey, you know, guys, you never should have moved there, you've got to move out? So I guess what I would say to you is, and this is one of the problems I see, all kinds of people come into us and they say, here's a desperate situation, we need $50 billion to restore the wetlands. And then someone else says, we need $50 billion to make sure we have medicine in case there's a pandemic of flu. And someone else comes and says, we need $50 billion to rebuild all the bridges that are going to collapse and the dams and all this. And I can't make $50 billion into $150 billion. I can't make, 12, hundreds of loaves and fishes. So how do I decide that? The one thing I'll tell you is the wrong way is to have Congress do it by pork, by who happens to be the most powerful member of Congress. My view is we ought to have like a base realignment closing commission, some group that will stand outside, that will evaluate the merits of these projects and what the downside risk is and make some decisions that way. But whether the right answer is to put all that money in wetlands, or whether it's to put it into bridges, or whether it's to put it into pandemic vaccines, I can't tell you, because that's a trade-off which I think needs to be made at a national level. I'm going to have my own views, but I think it's really above my pay grade.
On that note, we're going to thank you, Mr. Secretary.